Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into a topic that sounds absolutely wild, but it's a real part of our history, and in some places, is still a current reality. In the 19th century, a woman could be arrested not for stealing, not for violence, not for speaking out, but for wearing trousers. This is not metaphor. It is not exaggeration. It is historical fact. On a damp Victorian morning, authority did not arrive loudly. It arrived quietly, confidently, in polished boots and certainty. A woman walked alone down a public street. Her posture was upright, her pace deliberate. No skirt brushed the cobblestones. No petticoats swayed. Instead, two trouser legs moved in rhythm tailored, practical, unmistakably wrong. Heads turned before the law spoke. A woman in trousers did not merely break a fashion rule. She disrupted the visual order of society. She challenged assumptions so deeply embedded they passed for nature. And when authority stepped into her path, it was not cloth being questioned, it was power. Victorian society did not need a statute that said, "Women shall not wear trousers." In Britain, no such law existed, yet women were still stopped, detained, and punished. The mechanism was subtler and more dangerous. Vagrancy acts, public indecency laws, charges of masquerading or disturbing the peace. Vague laws enforced at discretion allowed the state to punish anything that made it uncomfortable. A woman in trousers, especially if walking alone, could be accused of deception, immorality, or social disorder. The crime was not impersonation. The crime was visibility. Across the Atlantic, ambiguity disappeared. American cities made their position explicit. By the mid-1800s, ordinances in places like San Francisco, Chicago, and Cincinnati criminalized appearing in public in a dress not belonging to one's sex. Women were fined, arrested, jailed. This was not symbolic enforcement. It was routine. In 1852, Amelia Bloomer introduced a practical alternative to restrictive women's clothing: loose trousers worn beneath a shortened skirt. The goal was health and mobility, not provocation. But society reacted as if a line had been crossed. Newspapers warned of moral collapse. Preachers claimed families would disintegrate. Political cartoons depicted trouser-wearing women as grotesque parodies, smoking cigars, abandoning children, emasculating men. None of this was evidence. It was fear. To understand the panic, you have to understand what trousers represented. They were not just garments. They were permission. Men wore trousers because men moved freely through public space. They worked, voted, traveled alone, entered contracts. Women's clothing, by contrast, was engineered to restrict. Corsets limited breathing. Skirts shortened stride length. Layers made speed and agility nearly impossible. This was not accidental design. It was discipline. Trousers allowed mobility, balance, endurance, independence, and independence for women was the real threat. The consequences were real. Women who wore trousers lost jobs, faced harassment, were publicly humiliated, sometimes arrested, often punished socially, before the law ever intervened. Yet some refused to comply. Dr. Mary Edwards Walker, Civil War surgeon, and the only woman to receive the Medal of Honor at the time, wore trousers because they made sense. She was arrested multiple times for it. She never apologized. She argued that restrictive clothing weakened women physically and politically. Her defiance forced a question society struggled to answer. Why was fabric being policed at all? Critics predicted catastrophe. They claimed trousers would erase womanhood, destroy marriage, and unravel society. None of it happened. There was no moral collapse, no social apocalypse. What did happen was measurable. Women walked farther, worked longer, participated more fully in public life, and visibility, more than anything, was what frightened those in power. That Victorian street was not just stone and smoke. It was a border. Public space belonged to man by default. A woman walking alone already challenged that. A woman walking alone in trousers shattered it. She did not need to speak. Her body made the argument. She may have been fined. She may have turned back. She may have walked on, but something irreversible occurred. The rules were exposed as constructed, not natural, not inevitable. And once a rule is revealed as made, it can be unmade. Sometimes revolutions begin with banners and speeches. Sometimes they begin with trousers, and this was only the beginning. If trousers frightened Victorian society, denim terrified the Cold War state, not because of how it looked, but because of what it meant. In the decades after World War II, a new kind of border descended across Europe. It was not only made of barbed wire, concrete, or armed guards. It was cultural, ideological, invisible, yet absolute. On one side, capitalism, consumer choice, individual expression. On the other, discipline, uniformity, ideological purity. And somewhere between the two, a pair of blue jeans. In the Soviet Union and across Eastern Europe, jeans were not just clothing. They were contraband, symbols of forbidden abundance, evidence of a world the state insisted did not exist, or, if it did, was rotten to its core. Officially, jeans were unnecessary. Socialist workers had uniforms, practical clothing, rational garments for rational societies. Western fashion was dismissed as decadent excess. Unofficially, everyone wanted denim. Teenagers learned quickly that jeans could not be bought, they had to be found, smuggled through borders, traded quietly, purchased on the black market for prices that could equal months of wages. Owning jeans was risky. Wearing them was riskier. Police did not need a specific law banning denim. Suspicion was enough. Jeans marked you as ideologically unreliable, as someone looking outward instead of inward, as someone who might listen to the wrong music, read the wrong books, ask the wrong questions. In some cities, authorities stopped young people on the street. They checked labels, inspected stitching, measured leg width. Western-style jeans were confiscated. Wearers were questioned. Names were recorded. Denim became evidence. The state understood something crucial. Jeans were not dangerous because they were American. They were dangerous because they normalized choice. They fit differently. They moved differently. They aged with the body, not the ideology. They suggested that comfort could matter, that individuality could exist. That identity was something you wore, not something assigned. In Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and the Soviet Union itself, jeans became a quiet rebellion. No slogans, no marches, just denim, worn low, faded intentionally, patched repeatedly. Each pair told a story of acquisition. Who smuggled them? Who sold them? Who risked punishment so they could exist at all? The irony was impossible to ignore. Socialist states that claimed to represent the worker feared the worker's trousers. Factories attempted to copy them. State-approved denim was produced, stiff, poorly dyed, unmistakably wrong. Everyone could tell the difference. Authentic jeans carried weight. They whispered of concerts, records, films, and freedoms never shown on state television. For young people, jeans were not about America. They were about possibility. Authorities responded predictably. Schools banned them. Employers discouraged them. Police monitored them. But repression only sharpened desire. The harder the state tried to erase denim, the more powerful it became. Jeans turned the body into a billboard the state could not fully control. And so the Cold War was not only fought with missiles and propaganda. It was fought in wardrobes, closets, and crowded apartments where teenagers tried on jeans in secret, staring at themselves in mirrors, imagining another life. No manifestos were written, no leaders emerged, but rebellion does not always announce itself. Sometimes it slips across borders, folded in a suitcase. Sometimes it survives by being worn. And when the Iron Curtain finally began to crack, it was not only ideology that poured through. It was music. It was language. It was denim. Clothing had done it again. Not by overthrowing power directly, but by making it look outdated. Because when a system fears fabric, it reveals its weakness. And jeans were only the beginning. When jeans slipped through the cracks of the Iron Curtain, the state still believed it could manage the damage. Punk proved otherwise, because denim could be explained away as comfort. Music could be censored, but punk was something else entirely. It was impossible to misread. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, punk began spreading eastward, not as an organized movement, not through official channels, but through rumor, bootleg tapes, whispered stories, and badly photocopied images. It arrived distorted, incomplete, and therefore more dangerous. In Eastern Europe, punk was not entertainment. It was defiance made visible, leather jackets torn on purpose, safety pins worn as decoration, hair spiked, dyed, shaved, or left deliberately unkempt. Nothing about punk looked accidental, and nothing frightened the state more than intention. Socialist regimes relied on predictability, uniforms, cues, approved hairstyles, regulated leisure. Punk rejected all of it at once. It refused discipline. It refused optimism. It refused to pretend that the future was already decided. Authorities understood the threat immediately. In Poland, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia, punk concerts were monitored, shut down, or banned outright. Clubs were raided, equipment confiscated, venues pressured into silence. Bands were denied permits or forced underground. But punk thrived precisely where it was not allowed. Teenagers gathered in basements, abandoned factories, and cramped apartments. Music was played too loudly, recorded poorly, copied endlessly. Lyrics were raw, often nihilistic, sometimes incoherent, and therefore impossible to sanitize. Punk did not offer a political program. That was the problem. It offered refusal to perform happiness, refusal to dress correctly, refusal to behave as if the system worked. Fashion was the most immediate battlefield. Punk clothing announced dissent before a word was spoken. You could spot a punk from across the street, and so could the police. Leather jackets marked wearers as suspicious. Safety pins suggested disorder. Boots implied readiness, not obedience. Even posture changed defiant, confrontational, deliberately visible. In East Germany, the Stasi catalogued punks meticulously. Names, photographs, associates. Punk fashion was treated as evidence of ideological unreliability. Young people were detained, interrogated, pressured to inform on friends. Some were expelled from schools or workplaces. Others were forced into military service. The message was clear: dress correctly or pay. In Poland, punk became entwined with broader resistance. Bands like Deserter and Brigada Kryzys attracted constant surveillance. Lyrics were dissected for subversion. Clothing choices alone could trigger police attention. Yet, the movement grew not despite repression, but because of it. Punk offered something socialism had promised, but failed to deliver: honesty. It did not claim the future would be bright. It did not pretend suffering was temporary. It wore its anger openly. This honesty was intolerable to regimes built on optimism. Punk fashion mocked authority by refusing to look respectable, and respectability was the currency of control. If you could not be shamed, you could not be governed in the usual way. The state responded by labeling punks as criminals, degenerates, foreign agents, Western corruption, they said, cultural sabotage. But many punks had never left their country. Some had never even seen the West. Their rebellion was local, personal, embodied. Punk did not ask permission, and that was its greatest crime. By the late 1980s, cracks were spreading everywhere. Economies faltered. Ideologies thinned. The state could no longer convincingly explain why leather jackets and torn shirts required surveillance files. When the system finally began to collapse, punk did not claim victory. It simply survived. And in surviving unruly, loud, visibly wrong, it proved something fundamental. That power can tolerate quiet dissatisfaction. It can tolerate private doubt. but it cannot tolerate dissent, you can see. Clothing had crossed another line, from practicality to individuality to outright confrontation, and the pattern was now unmistakable. When authority tightens control, rebellion changes how it dresses. Next time, it wouldn't be teenagers in basements. It would be the state itself, deciding what women must wear and what they must remove. Because when fashion becomes law, resistance is never far behind. When power fears clothing, it rarely stops at banning it. Sometimes it demands removal. In the 20th century, the state learned that control could look progressive, that domination could be framed as liberation, that forcing people to undress could be described as freedom. And nowhere was this contradiction more visible than in the politics of the veil. For centuries, veiling had carried different meanings across cultures: religious devotion, social custom, personal identity, family tradition. It was not a single symbol. It was many, layered and contextual. But modern states flattened it into one meaning only: submission. And once the veil was defined that way, removing it became a political project. In the 1920s and 1930s, a wave of forced unveiling swept across parts of the Muslim world, driven not by grassroots movements, but by authoritarian modernization. Leaders eager to signal progress toward Europe treated women's clothing as evidence of national backwardness. In Turkey, reforms under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk discouraged traditional dress as part of a sweeping secular transformation. While veiling was never legally banned nationwide, immense social and institutional pressure made visibility costly. The modern woman was unveiled, Western-dressed, and publicly aligned with the state's vision of progress. In Iran, the project went further. In 1936, Reza Shah issued the Kashf-e-Hijab decree, banning the veil outright in public spaces. Police were ordered to remove veils by force. Women were beaten in the streets. Families kept daughters indoors for years rather than expose them. What was described as emancipation felt like terror. Women who had once navigated public life through veiling were suddenly stripped of it without consent, without transition, without choice. Schools, offices, and streets became hostile terrain overnight. Freedom had arrived wearing a uniform. Colonial powers watched and learned. In French-controlled Algeria, unveiling became a spectacle. Colonial officials staged public ceremonies where Algerian women were encouraged, sometimes coerced, to remove their veils as proof of France's civilizing mission. Photographs were taken, headlines written, progress was declared. Yet, behind the camera, Algerian women resisted quietly. Some reveiled as soon as ceremonies ended. Others adopted new coverings, new strategies, new codes. Clothing became camouflage again, because forced unveiling was not about women. It was about visibility. The colonial and modernizing state wanted bodies it could read, categorize, and claim. The veil interfered with surveillance. It disrupted the gaze. It reminded power that not everything had been surrendered. Resistance followed a familiar pattern. When the state banned the veil became political. When the state demanded visibility, modesty became defiance. Later, the pattern reversed again. In the late 20th century, regimes that once forced unveiling now enforced veiling. In post-revolutionary Iran, women were legally required to cover their hair. What had once been forbidden became compulsory. The logic was unchanged. Control over women's bodies was simply dressed differently. Once again, clothing became law. Once again, non-compliance became rebellion. Women were arrested, fined, harassed, not for covering, but for uncovering, not for tradition, but for resistance. The state claimed morality. The state claimed protection. The state claimed righteousness. Women paid the price. Throughout these shifts, one truth remained constant. When the state decides what freedom looks like, freedom disappears. Choice is not liberation if it is mandatory. Visibility is not empowerment if it is enforced. Unveiling is not progress if it is violent. The veil was never the real issue. The issue was who decides. Across decades and borders, women learned to read power through fabric. They understood that when laws reach wardrobes, something deeper is at stake. Clothing becomes the front line. The body becomes territory. Identity becomes resistance. The state may change its language, modernization, morality, security, but its fixation remains the same. Control must be visible, and clothing, once again, refuses to cooperate, because whether banned or enforced, veiled or unveiled, regulated or forbidden dress becomes political the moment it is no longer chosen. And in that moment, resistance is inevitable. Next time, rebellion will not whisper, it will dance. Short skirts, loud music, public joy. Because when power demands seriousness, celebration itself becomes subversive, and the revolution, once more, will be worn. When power cannot ban rebellion outright, it ridicules it. When it cannot suppress change, it declares it dangerous. In the years after the First World War, the world was exhausted. Millions were dead. Empires were shaken. Old certainties lay in ruins. And into this fragile silence stepped a generation that refused to behave as if nothing had happened. They danced. The flapper did not arrive quietly. She appeared suddenly, short-haired, fast-moving, laughing too loudly. Her skirts rose inch by inch, season by season, until something unprecedented happened. Women's knees became visible. It sounds trivial now. At the time, it was explosive. In the early 1920s, knees were not neutral. They were guarded territory. A woman revealing them in public was not just immodest, she was ungovernable. Moralists did not argue about fabric. They argued about order. Newspapers warned of degeneration. Clergy preached about collapsing families. Psychologists, newly fashionable, diagnosed rebellion as pathology. The flapper, they said, was mentally unwell, infantilized, overstimulated by jazz. What terrified society was not sexuality. It was joy without permission. Flappers cut their hair not for men, but for speed. They abandoned corsets to breathe. They danced because stillness felt like death. The war had taught them something older generations could not accept. Obedience did not guarantee safety, so they refused it. Authorities responded in familiar ways. Cities debated hemline laws. Dance halls were raided. Schools sent girls home for skirts deemed too short. Employers dismissed women for looking modern, and yet the skirts kept rising. Because flappers were not a centralized movement. There were no leaders to arrest, no manifesto to censor. Fashion spread faster than law. Style outran enforcement. Critics framed flappers as a threat to civilization itself. They were accused of destroying femininity, weakening men, and abandoning motherhood. None of it was supported by evidence. What was documented repeatedly was this: women worked more. Women delayed marriage. Women claimed public space with confidence, and public space had never been designed for them. The Flappers' rebellion was not loud in the traditional sense. It did not shout slogans. It did not carry banners. It laughed, danced, and lived visibly. That visibility was the provocation. A woman enjoying herself in public without apology unsettled an entire moral framework, because discipline relies on shame. Flappers refused to feel it. By the late 1920s, what had once been scandalous became aspirational. Fashion houses followed. Advertisers adapted. The panic faded not because critics were convinced, but because they were outpaced. The body had moved on, and once again, clothing had done what arguments could not. It normalized the unthinkable. It revealed that morality, like fashion, changes when enough people stop obeying it. The flapper did not overthrow governments. She did something quieter and perhaps more lasting. She made freedom look fun, and that, for power, is always dangerous, because repression thrives on fear, but fear dissolves in laughter. And as the music played on, the lesson became clear. When control tightens, rebellion may shout, but when it loosens, rebellion dances. Next time, joy will not be enough. The backlash will be louder, the violence more visible, because when youth culture becomes a scapegoat, fashion becomes evidence, and the streets will turn hostile again. When fashion stops being tolerated, it becomes a target. And in the summer of 1943, clothing did not merely provoke outrage, it justified violence. The Zoot suit was impossible to ignore. Long, padded shoulders, high-waisted trousers ballooning at the thigh, tapering sharply at the ankle. Excess fabric in a time of rationing. To its wearers, mostly young Mexican-American, Black, and Filipino men, it was style, pride, and identity, stitched boldly onto the body. To authorities, it was defiance made visible. America was at war. Fabric was rationed. Obedience was patriotic. Uniformity was expected. The Zoot suit violated all three. Newspapers framed it as wasteful. Politicians called it un-American. Police labeled its wearers criminals long before any crime occurred. The suit itself became evidence proof, they claimed, of moral deficiency and foreignness. In Los Angeles, tension had been building for years. Mexican-American youth, often labeled pachucos, were already over-policed, surveilled, and scapegoated. Their clothing made them visible. Their visibility made them vulnerable. The violence did not erupt spontaneously. It was prepared. In June 1943, groups of U.S. servicemen, many stationed in Southern California, began roaming the streets in search of Zoot Suiters. They dragged young men from cafes and theaters. They stripped them publicly. They beat them while crowds watched. Police intervened rarely. When they did, they arrested the victims. The suits were torn off and burned. Hair was cut. Bodies were left bruised. The message was unmistakable: dress correctly or be punished. Media coverage was swift and revealing. Headlines blamed the wearers. The suits, not the attackers, were declared the problem. Articles claimed the clothing incited violence, as if fabric had thrown the first punch. This was weaponized style. The zoot suit became a proxy for race, class, and belonging. It allowed prejudice to disguise itself as patriotism, racism to masquerade as order. The irony was stark. Young men who were denied full citizenship were accused of betraying a nation that refused to protect them. Some zoot suiters were veterans themselves. Others would soon be drafted. None of that mattered. What mattered was that their clothing refused to shrink. The riots spread beyond Los Angeles to Detroit, New York, and other cities. Officials responded not by condemning violence, but by banning the suits. Los Angeles City Council outlawed them in public. The state sided with conformity. Yet the zoot suit did not disappear. It endured in memory, in music, in culture. It became a symbol of resistance, not because it was intended as protest, but because it survived being punished. The riots revealed a recurring truth. When society is under strain, style becomes scapegoat. When fear seeks an outlet, visible difference becomes dangerous. The zoot suit was never about cloth. It was about who was allowed to take up space, who was allowed excess, who was allowed joy in a time of discipline. Fashion had crossed another threshold, from rebellion to confrontation to violence, and still it persisted, because once clothing is used as justification for brutality, it exposes the system itself. The riots ended. The suits faded from the streets, but the lesson remained. When power feels threatened, it will tear rebellion off the body if it must. Next time, the state will not wait for chaos. It will regulate appearance from the beginning. Hair, uniforms, the body itself, because when clothing becomes evidence, even silence is suspect, and rebellion, once again, will find a way to be seen.